and welcome to Cahnmann's Current Event Roundtable Discussion. Today we have a wonderful group of men, and one of these days I'm going to have some women here. It seems like I'm always surrounded by men, but that's good. That's very good.
Is it raining then?
And I want to introduce you to, first I want to introduce you to Richard Baehr. To my right, he's the chief political correspondent of The American Thinker. And to my left is Michael Szanto, foreign policy analyst. Over here is Jeff Cohan, who's a lawyer. And a very big welcome back to John Cartland, our engineer. And welcome back to our show, John, and welcome to every one of us to the show this afternoon. And even welcome to myself. Today is going to be a very interesting discussion. Not only are we going to get to some other politics, hopefully, we only have a half hour, but we're going to take on something that is a very sensitive subject, and I need to get to it because a lot of people have been asking me when I'm going to have this on the show. And we're going to be talking about the new anti-Semitism today. And it's the rise and renewal of the new anti-Semitism. And I just want to read a little bit from one of the newspapers that this is a Jewish newspaper, and it was written by Michael Kotzen, and he writes, "The new anti-Semitism reflects continuity from the old, drawing upon its themes and images. Today, Israel is blamed for destabilizing the Middle East and for provoking violent but innocent seekers of justice to hate Israel and its friend, the United States." That is a mouthful. And I know, Richard, you've recently been on the Milt Rosenberg show, and I know this was one of the topics that Milt Rosenberg was recently in the March on radio, and I found it very fascinating, and I thought that we need to address anti-Semitism and what is new about it. I mean, historically, it's been going on for many, 2,000, how many years? 2,000 years ago. And why is it new? What's new about it?
Well, particularly in Europe, following the Holocaust, there was a period where a charge of anti-Semitism was something that was very much resented by any Europeans because they were trying to, in a sense, put on a new face. This was a new era. But what's now referred to as the new anti-Semitism usually is in the context of how people, and not just in Europe, but you see some traces of it, unfortunately, here in the United States, of how people react to Israel. And this has nothing to do with whether someone can come up with legitimate criticism of Israel. That occurs all the time in Israel itself and in the United States policy debate as well. But when Israel is treated differently than any other nation in the world, when certain things that Israel does are regarded as abusive or oppressive, but any other country in the world gets a pass. And when anything Israel does is right, is ignored because it's a Western country and is expected to be perfect, whereas the countries that are attempting to eliminate Israel or seek its destruction, the abuses that may occur with women, with gays, with minorities, with religious minorities, political minorities, all of them are viewed as acceptable because of a certain condescension that we don't expect much from these kind of countries, but Western nations have to be perfect. So it's treating Israel differently is, I think, what most people are referring to when they talk about the new anti-Semitism.
Well, has it also has, and feel free to jump in, any of you right now, are those that hate America and those who do so precisely because America's support for Israel? Do you think that, John? Do you have any feelings about that? Or?
Well, I often wonder why it seems like the United States is a standalone nation, and it's a very, very strong, uncritical support of Israel. And here again, Richard, I agree with you that often being against or questioning Israel and their policy is often conflated with being anti-Semitic, and I see them entirely different. I have a lot of criticism from time to time of Israel and continue to do so today, but I point out that the other 36 nations of the OECD nations all have a different view of Israel in the way they're treating the Palestinians, and the Palestinians are treating the Israelis completely different than what the United States stands. So
The Palestinians are the wealthiest group of people in the Arab world outside of the Gulf Arab oil states, actually. So, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the only Arabs who can vote for their leaders. So Israel has one of the top human rights records. Clearly, the European countries do a lot of trade with a number of Muslim oil producers, including Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they have their own interests. But I don't think we're a standalone nation. There was an enormous amount of coordination since 2005 between the U.S. and France, in particular, on the issue of Lebanon and confronting the Syrians. And I think there's an incredible amount of ignorance, and maybe even willful ignorance, about all of the massacres that continue to go on in the Arab world, in Iran. Today, it is not illegal to murder a Baha'i person. Their properties are being taken away. The Syrians didn't just massacre most of the people in Hama and wipe out most of that city. They went on in the early 80s to kill lots of random people who they suspected might be members of the Muslim Brotherhood. So I get concerned when people suddenly say, I care about human rights. And you say, okay, that's great. Human rights is very important. They say, I'm concerned about Israel. Israel has really good human rights. Arab countries, when they have protests, they level the towns. Israel sends their troops in, and they look out for the people who are committing acts of terror or violence against Israel.
That was true with, when they went into the camp in the West Bank with Jenin. Israel got a lot of complaints, but they could have just used their air force and taken it out.
Or tanks. They could have gone in with the tanks. It's very hard to destroy the
They lost people because they went in a careful manner.
House to house.
Yeah.
Well, you know, Israel has always been, the goal of Israel has always been, their goal is to end conflict and compromise on major issues. And the Palestinian goal is the end of Israel. Now, we hear that. Is that what really is the Palestinian goal, to get rid of Israel?
Well, you don't have any Palestinians on the panel, but I tend to agree with that, at least as far as the street goes, because if you look at how the children are taught in school, they're taught the greatness of being a martyr on behalf of the Palestinian cause. Nobody in Israel is taught to strap a bomb to themselves and go blow up other people.
Yeah, there's also a recent public opinion survey that showed that 84% of Palestinians approved of the slaughter of the kids in the yeshiva in Jerusalem, and roughly 65% supported the rockets coming out of Gaza, which are aimed indiscriminately at Israeli towns across the border. I remember Israel completely withdrew from Gaza. It pulled out 9,000 settlers. It removed the IDF. And since that time, approximately 5,500 rockets and mortars have been fired. Now, try to imagine if from Mexico and Canada, the United States received 5,500 rockets and mortars in the last 2.5 years. I think the amount of restraint that Israel has shown would not necessarily be duplicated in our own case if we were getting that kind of those kind of attacks.
Well, why does Israel get criticized all the time? You always hear
Well, I'll give you for example.
Yeah, go ahead.
On the settlements, in the expanded settlements in East Jerusalem and what have you, and on the West Bank and what have you, their leadership over there gave President Bush virtual assurance that they would cease the expansion of the settlements. As soon as George, our president, got home, the expansion of the settlements continued. Jimmy Carter has got the view in his book, and I'm no great admirer of Jimmy Carter. I followed him on many, many things, but one thing in his book he did say that I hold with. It was the radicals on both sides that have kept peace at bay in the Middle
The
East.
Jews accepted the partition in 1947. The Arabs said, we don't want any Jews there. And the reason that the UN decided to have a partition is because of the fighting that started when the Mufti of Jerusalem said, we want to kill all the Jews, we don't want Jews here. And by the way, let me tell you something about the settlements. In 1948, all of the Jews were kicked out from the West Bank in East Jerusalem. And the Jordanians actually did pass a law saying that Jews cannot own land. Israel today, in pre-67 borders, has 1 million Arab citizens, about 80-90% of them Muslim. They kicked out all of the Jews from East Jerusalem and the West Bank for the first time in 2,000 years. So I consider it disputed territory. I don't think that anyone should say that there should be no Jews in the West Bank or East Jerusalem.